Hi, my name is Patrick Young and thank you for coming. Today I'll be training you on basic motherboard installation. I have built many computers in the past and therefore I have a lot of knowledge and experience with installing and preparing motherboards. I know from experience that proper motherboard preparation and installation will help avoid problems in the future with your computer. Properly preparing the motherboard by firstly installing the central processing unit, also known as the CPU, the heatsink fan, and the memory, also known as RAM, will allow for an easier installation before the motherboard actually goes into the case. Also, following proper installation procedures will help save the headache of a problem occurring in the future. The first thing you're going to want to do is make sure you have everything set up on a table where you have a lot of space to work. First, you're going to want to prepare the motherboard by installing the things I listed before, the central processing unit, the heatsink, and the RAM. According to Daryl Grant from neoseeker.com, by preparing the motherboard, it'll save you problems in the future because working inside the case can be a very tight space. Therefore, preparing it before it goes inside the case will allow for an easier installation and hopefully allow you to not have any problems. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do with preparing your motherboard is install the CPU. The CPU is pretty easy to install. The first thing you're going to want to do is, on the motherboard, lift the lever of the CPU socket. Once the lever of the CPU socket is open, it will allow you to insert the CPU into the motherboard socket. Before you insert it, you want to align the pins on the bottom of the CPU to the holes on the motherboard CPU socket. Once you have the holes and pins matched up, you can gently place the CPU into its place. Now that the CPU is sitting on its socket on the motherboard, you can simply close the lever to secure it in place. Now you have your CPU installed onto your motherboard. The next step in preparing your motherboard is to install the heatsink fan, which allows to keep the motherboard and the CPU cool while it's running. The first thing you want to do to install your heatsink fan is to take it and place it on top of the CPU socket. Once you have it in its place, you can secure it by fastening the clips to this motherboard. Once the clips are fastened, you can simply plug the cable into the motherboard, allowing the fan to have power and work. Furthermore, you're going to want to install your memory, also known as RAM, onto your motherboard before installing it into your computer. To install the memory onto your motherboard, you're going to want to first open the clips for the RAM socket on the motherboard. Once the clips are open, you need to align the notches on the memory stick to the notches of the RAM socket. Once you have it aligned, you can place the RAM inside its socket. Then you just need to apply even pressure on top of the memory, allowing it to gently slide into place. Applying even pressure will automatically fasten the clips on the memory and secure it in place. Now we have our motherboard properly prepared, allowing us to install it into our case. According to Gabriel Torres from HardwareSecrets.com, you're going to want to follow certain steps to install the motherboard into the case to help avoid any problems, also to allow for an easier process. Now that we have our motherboard properly prepared, we can install it in our case. We first need to align the holes on the motherboard with the holes on the case. The case has many different holes for spacers. Not all motherboards are the same, therefore we have to line up the holes for our motherboard to the holes on the case so we know where to place the spacers. So the first thing in installing the motherboard is look at the holes on the case and match them up with the holes on the motherboard. The holes in the case. Once we know which holes to install the spacers into, we can simply insert our spacers into the case. Like this. Once we have all the spacers installed into the case for our motherboard, we can simply set the case on its side and then gently pick up the motherboard and place it on top of the spacers. You're going to want to assure that the holes on the motherboard line up with the spacers we just installed. Once you know that your holes are lined up with the spacers, you can take your Phillips screwdriver and install your screws and washers onto the motherboard. Once the motherboard is properly tightened in with screws, you're ready to go. You're going to want to make sure to install the spacers, the washers, so the metal on the motherboard doesn't make contact with the screws. This can be very hazardous if you don't. Now, I just showed you how to properly prepare the motherboard by firstly installing the CPU, the heatsink fan, and the memory before the motherboard is installed into the case. I also showed you the steps in installing the motherboard into the case by first aligning the holes with the motherboard in the case, installing the spacers, and then assuring that the spacers and motherboard align up, and then tightening the screws into the spacers. Following these steps and proper procedures will save you many headaches in the long run, because you won't run into any problems of your computer crashing or even hardware failure. Are there any questions? Thank you for attending.